steadily working on lowering that pressure valve, right? Releasing it, releasing it, releasing it. And one of my favorite things that I have been learning, and I will link in the M&M this week, our last meditation and mindfulness, which includes a reflection on where you want to go next with your meditation practice. One of the things that I learned from a talk I listened to, and I'll link the talk in the M&M, is this idea. It was from a Martha Beck talk. Did we watch a Martha Beck talk? I can't remember if this class or Site 20. But anyway, she's a really great life coach. She's absolutely wonderful. I'll bring her up here for you so you can see. She starts the opening of her gathering room conversations, and these are like short 30-minute. They're great to listen to for new insights and stuff. She's an amazing life coach, like my favorite one. And anyway, she's been through an enormous amount of hardships herself. Just like, this is someone who's gone through a lot. And she tells her story here and there so you can catch up on it. But in one of these gathering rooms, Martha Beck was talking about years ago when she was dealing with bulimia. And one of the things that she did, she had an epiphany realization when she opened her refrigerator at some point in her process, that I don't have to eat because I feel upset. You know, she's sort of, I don't have to eat because I feel upset. And so that triggered me in my mind to start thinking about this week's mindfulness practice, which is I don't have to. I don't have to, because we get a lot of impulses from within that are conditioned impulses. Like, for example, me, I'm very much wired to be a nurturer and a caregiver. I'm sort of biologically already wired that way. And then that was heavily reinforced by my environment, right? Because people love it, so they're going to reinforce it. So why wouldn't they? So now there's this part of me that sort of is an impulse, right? My mind has learned to be quiet with the words, because it's learned I don't pay much attention to the words of the default mode network anymore. They don't hook me so much. So it's gone underground, and it sort of uses energy now, like pressure energy or pushing energy to get me to do stuff instead of talking to me meanly. So I've been saying this practice of, I don't have to do that. Or do I have to do that? Do I really have to do that? Right? Because I'll feel this pressure. And this is for you, Jenna. I'll feel this pressure. And I'll have to, do I really have to do that? Because what'll happen is I'll set up some things in my mind that I want to do, but they're not necessarily have to's, right? Like, I have to get ready. I'm going to get ready for this journey and this trip with my husband, and to do his surgery and stuff. And before, I have all these things in my mind with the house that I want to get done before we go. But a lot of those are not things that I have to get done before we go. I've just put them in, but once they're on the list, that inner part of me is just going to push it, push it, push it. It's going to create this inner push. Do I have to do it that way? Do I have to? So I just want to encourage us. I learned that lesson, wanted to share, and it's really been helping me. It's really been helping me go, do I really have to do it that way? Do I really have to do it that right now? Do I really have to do all of that? Do I really have to? Is there another way that would be gentler, kinder, easier on myself and the environment around me, right? So that's our M&M mindfulness practice. Today's talk is on the deep self. I'm going to introduce you to Freud and Jung, who are two famous psychologists that studied with each other. They would be very much like me and you, right? Because there was a teacher and then there was a student. And the student is supposed to learn everything the teacher knows and then become better than the teacher. That's how it's supposed to be, okay? They're supposed to eventually transcend the teacher. And the teacher is supposed to be ready to deal with that, not to be like, oh, no one can transcend me. No, y'all are supposed to be better in your own ways. So there was Freud. You've heard of Freud. You've probably heard of Carl Jung. Jung was Freud's student. So we're going to be talking about Freud, Jung, and the deep self. And What we want to do in today's meditation, which we'll go ahead and start with, a relaxing meditation and centering ourselves, is we want to drop in and connect with that deep self. And the deep self is felt in your body, in your body. It's not up here. This is your egoic conscious mind, incredibly valuable tool. You can see it as like your spotlight of awareness. Okay, but you can expand your awareness to accompany your entire self. So we're not just sitting up here in our head, but we're feeling an expansive sense of self, both within, that develops that introception, that familiarity of within our body, and then noticing the without, right? From a centered space of within. So the deep self is deep within you. And Jung talked a lot about the deep self. It's also referred to as the higher self, but it's deep within us. It connects to the higher forces, but the higher self is actually deep within you from Jung's point of view. And the idea of the higher self actually comes from Jung. So let's start with a meditation and see if we can experience dropping into our deep self. And you know, you experience connection with your deep self all the time. And the idea is for us to know that, to become aware of that. So it's not like something you have to learn how to do. It's more like something to awaken to, right? To become more aware of is already happening, tune into, and just allowed to be part of your experience. Jung argued, and I believe it's completely true, that it's the job of the ego to live in service of this deep self. All felt your deep self. You all feel your deep self all the time. We just don't spend a lot of time tuning in. When we want to tune in and really find the answer to what's important to us, that's where we drop into, because that deep self has the whole picture. And it is a place without words. All right, so we'll do a little academia now. Okay, this is kind of a brutal introduction. I need a couple of warm-up slides, I see, because I'm sort of going too fast. But Sigmund Freud, you've heard about, and he did his work. He wrote his big book called The Interpretation of Dreams that made him super famous in 1900. So that's a good way to think about what we're going to do. I want to show you a picture of Freud so you can see what Freud was like. And Freud is considered the father of psychoanalysis. And there were other people before Freud who thought about these things. He just made it really famous, sort of like the Carl Sagan of, this is Freud with his famous cigar, right? Let's look at Freud's study. So he started this thing called psychotherapy. This was Freud's psychotherapeutic couch right there, and people would lie there and just talk off the top of their head for hours and hours and hours, multiple times a day. And this is a very proper society where when we're on our very best behavior, that's how people tried to behave all the time, right? So we're more relaxed now, but then that's what it like. And Freud would sit here, people would not be looking at him, they would be lying on the famous couch. You can see he had things from, you know, all over the world, antiquities that he collected. He loved to study cultures all over the world. And Freud's, well, look at his psychoanalytic society of people, and Jung, who we're going to talk about as well, who had a different version of the psyche than Freud. There's Jung right there. They were very, very close. Jung was Freud's favorite student. This is Freud and Jung together right there. And Freud tried to make his version of understanding the psyche very scientific, because 1900, he was very informed by Darwin, who was in the mid 1800s. And so, and we have empiricism, which is basing knowledge based on science, is starting to really emerge, right? So we didn't really have a formal field of psychology. It was underdeveloped. So he developed this idea of the human psyche called the iceberg theory of consciousness. And it consisted of the id, ego, and superego, 3 parts. Now, the iceberg part means that our awareness is just the tip of the iceberg, and then there's all these processes that run underneath, right? And we can think about a lot of these processes are the body running, automatic processes. We have learned that some of those automatic processes, you can see consciousness is in the light, that's the light of awareness. And then what's unconscious is below the surface, what we're not paying attention to or we're not aware of. Like we're not paying attention to all the processes involved in our heart beating, in our liver function, in our digestive function. All these processes we're not ignoring. Similarly, there's some processes in the psyche that we're not paying attention to, and we've been really looking at those. The default mode network is a process that happens automatically on the side. It just picks up information on the side automatically, right? And it stores and encodes it into memory, and then it runs off of that memory. So if I said to you, for example, okay, I'll pay you $5,000 if at the end of the month you remember these three numbers, 1, 3, and 7. Okay, $5,000. Do you think you could remember those three numbers, 1, 3, and 7? Yeah, okay. Do you think you would still remember those if I asked you in a year, do you remember those numbers that you earned the $5,000? Do you think you'd still remember them? Yes, you wouldn't have forgotten them because you already got the $5,000. They would be pretty well encoded into the memory because you would be reminding yourself of them, right? So basically our mind memorizes things automatically and those memories stay in, and the memories, that part of our mind that we call the default mode network, which is the limits of many people's understanding of their ego because they're so enmeshed with the default mode network that that's who they are. Whereas we can stand aside and observe it and go, yeah, my example that I used of the default mode network was back when the campfire happened. Obviously it was a difficult time because we had to, leave and our house got burned down and that, but basically, while that was going on, I was teaching a meditation class, and my default mode network would say things like, this sucked, this is really screwed. And I would be standing on a beautiful day holding a latte, perfectly safe, my needs taken care of, right? Now I know there was loss and trauma to process over that, but the moment was not totally screwed. I had a Starbucks in my hand. I had a safe place to stay. Things were going to be, I had a job, things were going to be okay. It's like, it's interesting how the default mode network will narrate and interpret basically from the standpoint of everything has to be good for me or it's going to be unhappy. Whereas we can open up to allowing that things can be good even when we're facing challenges. So anyway, all right. So the default mode network, long story short, default mode network, we've learned since Freud is a program that runs both, that we can be aware of, but it also runs unconsciously. Like when you drive to somebody's house and the whole time you're chatting with your friend, so your awareness is going on chatting with your friend, but some part of your awareness kept attention on everything else as well, right? So the default mode network ran the car, and it's very handy to have a default mode network, but we can't because it drives the car. It puts things on autopilot, but we don't want the autopilot to be the pilot, right? So that's part of the evolution that we're learning in this. So your ego is more complicated because it's aware of this unconscious and partly unconscious, partly conscious dynamic of the default mode network. And below the water is what's unconscious, what we're not aware of. And the idea is that this line can change with awareness. So you can become more and more and more aware and of what is unconscious. Now, Freud had a pretty simple model of the unconscious or of the psyche. And he said it was broken into basically 3 parts. And there were other dimensions too, but essentially 3 parts. The egoic part of ourselves is our awareness that navigates, it's aware, that navigates through the world. And it obviously has a narrow frame because we can only pay attention to so much at once. The id is sort of the primal part of ourselves. It's sort of our animal instinctual body. And when we go rah, 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 because when we get annoyed with somebody, what road rage is an id response, right? We're not thinking thoughtfully through it. It's just sort of a primitive, aggressive response to somebody getting in our way, right? So these kinds of things, id responses sort of surface up. They're instinctual and sort of primitive. I think of the id as like a 3-year-old, right? 3-year-olds are walking ids, right? They're pleasure seeking, they're impulsive, they don't restrain their impulses. They want what they want when they want it, and they let you know how they feel about things. So they're not civilized, so to speak. And the civilizing force is called the superego. So we have the id, the ego, and the superego. The primitive parts, sort of the primal parts of us that surface, particularly when our ego gets tired, our more primal parts, and also in dreams, these more primal instincts surface, and desires. And one of the ways I experience my id surfacing, for example, is sweets. Whenever I get tired, I want to go get something sweet, and that's sort of a pleasure seeking part of ourselves. And then the ego, and then the superego is the 3-year-old getting socialized, turning into what we are now. And the superego, Freud's superego, would be the same as our default mode network, the part of our mind that is telling ourselves how we should be all the time, right? So it's just a basic, simple 3-part model. And the way they're structured here is just showing that most of the id responses sort of bubble up from underneath the superego. We can be both aware and unaware of our superego conditioning. This is our conditioned self, the superego, how we've been trained and taught to be, where I mentioned to do the, do I challenge the impulses of I have to that come from within? Those I have to impulses are superego impulses. They match Freud's superego model. So, I've developed a map inside myself, kind of a psychic structure that says I should be caring and giving, and so I should do this. I have to do that to match the sort of unconscious superego structure. And we can have complexes down here, like an inferiority complex or a superiority complex that can be lodged in the superego. And stuff about this is like what you learn in Psych 1, Introduction and Principles, these kinds of personality theoretical ideas, if you're drawn to this kind of stuff. So this is another picture of Freud's model that you can look at sometime if you want. I tell a little story that's kind of handy for understanding the id, ego, and superego. About, let's say you're home, your ego decides, okay, I want to study tonight for my test. I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to do anything. But I'm just going to study because I have a test tomorrow. And then there you are, all set up to study, and the phone rings, and you pick it up, and the friend says, hey, why don't you come over? We're having a little gathering at my house. It's going to be really fun. Meet some people. You're like, no, I'm going to study tonight. That's cool, right? I'm good. So then they go, come on, you can come. And so now you're torn between the pleasure part of yourself that wants to go play, the ego part of yourself that decided it was going to get the work done, and the super ego part of yourself that's saying, you really need to study, you have to study, your parents said they won't help you out if you don't get good grades, you got to study. So you've got this split going on. And then your friend says, that guy you want to meet, he's going to be there. And you go, oh, okay, I'll go study. So then your id wins. Right? So that's the idea of the id, ego, superego. And Freud saw this as always a set of tensions where these things have cross purposes, right? The superego wants you to study all the time. The ego wants to have some kind of balance. The id wants to play all the time, right? So they're all surfacing at different times. And we can kind of catch ourselves when we're in an id mode. And we can certainly notice the superego because it's the voice inside of ourselves that says should all the time. And the default mode network, in other words, it was sort of absorbed by society. It's how our psyche sponged in societal expectations. And it does that underneath the surface implicitly. It absorbs. Like it sees a bunch of things on media that everybody should be cute and perky and happy. And so it absorbs the idea of you should be cute and perky and happy and spits that back at you. Maybe not. Maybe there's something more complex than always being cute and perky and happy. Maybe life is a little bit richer than that sort of superficial image clip that you saw on Instagram of cute and perky and happy. Repeated, 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 repeated. Not good repetitions, because it's not true. Those people aren't always cute. In fact, they've done research and found that the more constantly somebody shows themselves as cute and perky and happy, the less likely that is realistically true about them. All right, so then we have Carl Jung, and Carl Jung differed from Freud, and this created a real fracture in their relationship, because he said that the unconscious consisted of more than the id, ego, and superego. He came up with a more complex view, and he came up with some words that you probably heard, like collective unconscious and archetypes as being part of our unconscious. And here it is, the deep self down there, what Jung actually referred to as the higher self. So Jung had a self one and self two, and he's the source of the higher self and the idea of the higher self. Bill W. met with Jung, was inspired by Jung. Bill W. is behind the 12-step program, which is a genius-inspired program, right? That has helped millions of people for free, probably billions of people. Anyway, Jung is the source of our idea of the higher self, or the word languaging of the higher self, but you can see how he sees it here in the middle of the self. And he sees it as the conduit to God, the conduit to all of creation, right? Of the creative impulse, that which we do not know. Look at his logic. Here's what we know up here in the light of awareness, but there's a lot we don't know. And so the self is the connection, the conduit to what we don't know. And all creativity comes from the unknown to the known. So it comes up, it bubbles up from the unknown to the known, from the darkness to the light. If we were to think about the yin yang model of chaos and order, from the chaos to the order, from the unknown to the known. So the deep self is the one that is directly corded to the great mystery, right? All that is, the source of light, what beats your heart, the magic that beats your heart, the magic of life. So we want to cultivate a relationship with the deep self. We want to cultivate a connection to that inner self. And that's what you've been doing this whole time with your meditation and mindfulness practice, is getting more and more familiar to dropping in to your inner being, the being within you, both within your body and within your soul. So Freud and Jung both studied dreams a lot, and they saw dreams and imagination as both sources of messages from the unconscious self, like another source of message from the unconscious, from our deeper unconscious, this part of ourself, that Jung says we want to have a close relationship. We want to get to know this part of ourselves, because then it becomes conscious. It becomes part of our conscious awareness. And so our conscious awareness gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and it shines more and more and more down, right? So other ways that we bring information from the unconscious to the conscious are like intuitions, epiphanies, moments of delight when you feel called to something, and synchronicities. So when you're delighted by something, that's your deep self experiencing that delight and bubbling it up, right? You don't think down, I feel delight, and down it goes. It comes up, right? So that's how so delight is deep within. Feeling a calling comes from within, feeling called to do something, and everybody feels called to do something. A lot of the callings that we need to listen to are small. They're the calling to call a friend and see how they're doing. We feel they're little nudges from the back of us that encourage, that are not coming from top down, from within the body, like something that we really feel drawn to do. And a lot of times we slough them off. One of the things I really feel drawn to do is to draw little cute animated characters, right? I want to be able to illustrate stuff with fun little characters. And so that's a kind of like, it comes from deep within. Something you feel that you want to do that comes from deep within is what a calling is. All right, and synchronicities are magical coincidences. So Jung's psychology started to become soul psychology or depth psychology, because the word soul, which he means by the deep self, is gets confused with religious ideas of soul. So they called it depth psychology. So we're going to look in a minute at a little video. I don't know why I put the collective unconscious stuff in here. I'm sure there was a reason. Well, you've heard of the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious, in Jung's view, is the idea that just like our bodies have DNA memory about how to create a human body that we pass on as we have children, our psyches also have a DNA memory that have a structure to it. And so, and knowledge, like our bodies have the knowledge of how to operate that comes from our ancestral past. Our psyches also have knowledge about how to operate that comes from our ancestral past. And that knowledge about how to operate that comes from our ancestral past comes through in myths and stories that are metaphors for us that feed back to our deep self about how to be and live in the world, right? The great myths and legends of the world. We talked about this in the last class, Jenna, in Psych 20. And one of the great mythological structures is called the heroic journey. And there are what's called archetypes in our lives. And these are archetypes, or Plato, it helps me to go back to Plato's idea of pure forms to explain archetypes. Plato had an idea of pure forms. So his idea of pure forms was that there was a realm in which the sort of archetype or pure form of the horse lived, and all horses on earth are reflections of that pure form. Okay, so same idea with Jung of pure forms and archetypes, only these are sort of stamped within us like a DNA. So they're not another realm necessarily. It's all part of our encoding. And part of our encoding is to recognize certain archetypes in life, like the trickster, Mother Earth, and the wise man. So the Earth Mother, nurturing Earth Mother, the wise guide, and then the trickster. We'll look at those archetypes. Genetically encoded and transferred. So the archetypes, the patterning of how to work with life, which is laid out, by the way, in the tarot. The tarot cards, if you don't look at them as a future telling thing, but rather as a metaphor for what's in the psyche and the life journey, then you can see that they lay it out, particularly the major arcana part of the tarot card, lay out the path of what life is like. They're like a mythology. They're like a story. So mental patterns shared by members of a single culture and by all human beings. So we're all human beings are connected by the collective unconscious. In a sense, it could be compared to the Akashic records. So archetypes are deep, enduring patterns of thought and behavior embedded in the human psyche that remain powerful a long period of time and transcend cultures. So they're cross-cultural. That means a person in Egypt and a person in modern America would see a symbol or something like the star, an object like the star, or an object like a lion, and the symbolic associations to those two things would be similar for someone in Egypt to someone now. So someone in Egypt, the symbolic tree of associations with a star and us, we would associate it with hope, with possibility, with guiding light, right? And a lion with strength, with power. Okay, so these symbolic associations that we do are that we have in common amongst us, not unique ones to each culture, but the ones in common amongst all humans are archetypes. And some of the archetypes are circle, water, resurrection, and sacrifice. And these four archetypes have common meaning across cultures. In fact, the circle is the oldest thing we ever drew. In fact, the circle with a dot in the middle is one of the oldest things ever drawn by human beings ever, which is absolutely fascinating. It's a primal archetype for the self. For the self, it means me. That's what the circle with a dot in the middle. And that's why we like coloring those mandalas, those coloring circles, because we are drawing the archetype. This is, the archetype. So circles represent whole, the whole thing, right? Non-duality in a way, right? Because we've got the yin yang in, which is duality, one side and the other side, but we also know there's the whole. So we've got both sides plus the whole. We're all threes. Water, as symbolizes around cultures all over the world, as a source of life, as a source of breaking things down, and as a source of purification. Resurrection, these are examples of other times where resurrection is a big theme, where something is destroyed and then that destruction brings new life. And then sacrificing, letting go of the old self to transform, releasing something for something to transform. So these are all ancient archetypes. And then there's the archetype, like we talked about in the last class, Jenna, in Psych 20, of the archetypal hero, right? So this, every character in every story that you see is an archetypal hero, and it follows an archetypal pattern called the heroic journey that we won't be talking about in detail today. But basically, you are the hero. That every story you watch is a reflection of you, and is an ancient mythological structure coming to tell you how to live life, giving you its insights and ideas. It's a wise tale from a wise elder. Now, shortcut version of the heroic journey of our lives is that we go out and we have some kind of challenge to face. We all have challenges, seems like all the time, right? We go through brief little periods where there's no challenge, but man, they're brief. Because if you look at the different dimensions of life, of relationships, health and physical well-being, money and prosperity, and then creativity and feeling good existentially within yourself, keeping all those balls in the air and doing great at all times, rare. Oh, and what about the world? Concerns about the world. So there's always challenges. It's just the nature. We're in this video game of challenges. As above, so below. As here, so in video games. As in video games, so here. So, and these, interestingly, it's always intriguing to me. I just love the realization that the challenges are always depicted as like impossible, like overwhelming foes, just like ours are, right? And in every case, well, there's often a trickster or a villain, something trying to get you off the path, okay? And the goal is for the hero to overcome the challenge. And in order to do that, they have to draw on they have to gain new skills. They have to basically allow themselves to transform. They have to die to their old self. That's what the phoenix and the lotus both represent. Die to their old self for their new self to emerge. So there are things that we always need to be willing to shed, like a snake sheds its skin. There are things that we have to be willing to let go of all through our lives. Aspects of ourselves that we need to release and let go, that we've essentially gotten to the place where we've outgrown, so that we can rise. So that's what the phoenix represents. And the lotus flower specifically represents that the beauty, the gold, the pearl in you rises out of the murk, out of the swampland. That's where it comes out of the swamp. It comes out of the dark water of trying times, okay, which is part. So Yoda coming out of the swampland, was living in a swamp, was on purpose by George Lucas. He was a direct connection to the lotus flower. George Lucas did everything based on the heroic journey archetype, which originally came from Jung and then was talked about by Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist. So the deep self is an archetypal reality inside of you, per Jung. And the symbol for the deep self is the mandala. So it's an idea of totality that is not identical with the ego. Remember how it exists deep in the psyche, but it encompasses the entire psyche. And it's aware of everything. And it's the job of our ego, which moves through life, to connect with the deep self, tune in and connect with it, and then live life in attunement with the deep self, not all by itself. If the ego is trying to live life by itself, messed up. The deep self is connected to nature, and it's connected to whatever higher forces, whether they're ideals or God or whatever that represents to you. It's connected to both on all sides, right? A light which is not just our light. Okay, this is Michael Meade on the deep self. So Michael Meade is a great Jungian psychologist. And, you know, he was talking about, not in this video, but another one, he talks about drumming. And it made me realize that I should make drumming part of this class, because drumming is a rhythmic way of meditating. And there's some people that have a hard time with the breath. And drumming would be a great way into the breath. In fact, my son's a drummer. I'm going to work with him to come up with some simple drumming lessons. We don't have to drum on a drum. We can drum on a table. It's the rhythm. We can drum on our body. So it's the rhythm. But I gained that insight finding this video. So let's check it out. Michael Meade on the deep self. This is a short 5-minute clip.
The old idea is that each person has an ego. You could call it the little self. It thinks it's the big self. It sometimes thinks it's the only self. And it thinks it's at the center of itself, but it also can think it's at the center of the world, and yet it isn't. You can think of it as a ruler on a shaky throne. And what makes it shaky is it's not solidly grounded in the essence of life. It's kind of a construction made during childhood so we can present ourselves to the world and other people in a certain way. But it is a presentation that moves away from the real depths of life, what I call the deep soul, or Carl Jung called the deep self. And so the idea is we have to at times depart from the realm of the little self or the ego and descend towards what they call the greatest self hidden within.
That's what you're doing when you meditate. That's the true purpose of meditation, to drop into that. And all you have to do is invite it. Don't expect fanfare, confetti, and it's just a dropping into like the still waters. In the East, they call it the subtle energy body. It's subtle. It's shy. It's not really shy, but we could think of it as shy, because if we think of it as shy, we won't make it our fault that we're not all connected. You already are connected with your deep self. You're just bring that more into the light of your awareness. You can never not be connected with it, but you can direct your life with more awareness by becoming more aware of it and become more in attunement with it. And Jung saw this as really the path of life. The first part in your late teens, early 20s is to have an established ego so you can go out there and function in the world. But then it's also to drop down and to co-join that ego with the deep self, so you're operating from your heart. You can think of it as operating from your heart.
Or the deep soul within each person. And the idea is the little self or the ego is actually connected to that deep self, but likes to pretend that it is the central self. But the deep self or the deep soul is this old idea that was found throughout the world in all the spiritual practices and in all the religions. The idea that there's something deep, a sense of being, a resource that we can tap into, but also this centered deep self is the place of the giftedness that's natural to each person. And so the idea throughout life.
Okay, I want to call attention to that phrase he just said there. The deep self is the source of the gift that's natural to each person. Now, Jung said that everybody has a genius, a deep self gift. Einstein said that everybody is a genius. But if a fish is thrown out of water, then it won't look like a genius. You got to put it in the water. So it's got to be in its matrix for the genius to show, right? And so the more we tune into this, the more we can help match ourselves to an external matrix in the world, the right job, for example, that like I have so gratefully, that because I get to work with you, that is both, that serves, where the ego is able to serve the deep self and make a contribution in the world. Now, the path to this is knowing what delights you, because the deep self delight is the deep self expressing itself. So when you are delighted, and delighted is special because there's some heart in there, right? It's not just sort of, it's not a one of our more, it is a deeper, richer pleasure. So when you are delighted by a child's life, delighted by a flower, or delighted or intrigued is another clue. When you find something intriguing, you are, this is the deep self speaking within you, right? I find, so this is you tuning, you are attuned with your deep self when you find something intriguing. So it's not far from you, it's right there.
To get more and more connected to that deep self and get more and more access to the inner gifts and learn how to bring them up and express them and put them out into the world, because that's what makes the world beautiful and meaningful. And the people that we admire the most are usually people who have found some conscious connection to their gifts and learned to give them. The beautiful singers and the musicians and the painters and all the people that bring beauty and meaning into the world. But we are all that, each person here to articulate the artful qualities buried within them. And everyone, when they awaken to the depths of their own soul, has knowledge and gifts to give and medicine to bring forth, because music is medicine and art is medicine, and being a good at conversation and being an empathic person is medicine. All the different forms of expression and articulation from the depth of the soul, they're all medicines. And by now, I think we're all being called to be medicine people. But it was really interesting to me after the first event in this series to wake up into the story of how healing began. And I want to underline the idea that it begins when we look into the darkness, when we allow ourselves to face the unknown. The unknown only occurs at the edge of what we know. It's actually just past there. And it requires facing the darkness. And what I've learned from stories.
So the darkness isn't necessarily negative stuff. The darkness is when you close your eyes and go within and explore the unknown territory of the within you. Sometimes you feel uncomfortable sensations. And when you do that, we can open ourselves and become porous like a sponge. Don't reject ourselves. Stay with ourselves. We don't have to reject our own experience. We can be with our own experience with openness, like Franklin taught us. Hugging and loving. Another method I like to use, because I use Franklin's a lot, is of loving that painful part of our being, welcoming it in, that experience, that feeling. But also, I also like to feel my body as being more porous, so that I can, and having a loving kindness, openness to it, and letting it flow on and out, rather than contracting to those painful feelings and kind of holding them in. Instead, allowing them to flow, right? Becoming more porous and open, welcoming the feeling of them and allowing them to flow on, right? So again, darkness does not mean negative or painful or uncomfortable feelings or trauma. It simply means, like when we close our eyes and we first go through our body, it's rather mysterious because we're not used to putting our attention there.
It's not as if we have to figure it all out. We just have to get on the path that we're called to. We have to have the courage of facing the darkness inside as well as the darkness in the world. And we have to go as far as we can go. And then the other world, the unseen, the divine, whatever it is that's across from us, meets us halfway, delivers inspiration, delivers something, some great imagination that we didn't know we were capable of. The world, from the idea of the world behind the world, the eternal world, is trying to renew the world. The world is trying to renew in the midst of its own collapse. That's the old notion. And so we're being called into that. We're into it, whether we like it or not. And so we might as well do the conscious descent in order to awaken more fully, and then follow the path of awakening. I know I'm being general, but honestly, that's what I think we're here for. That's what the human soul has always been here for, to accept our lot in life. And the collective lot in life right now is suffering and pandemic and fear and anxiety. We accept that and then find in the darkness inside, in the underside of the lot of life, our connection to imagination and to the divine, and we live it out as best we can.
Isn't he wonderful? Isn't he wonderful? He was one of those I grew up with, Michael Meade. He's my age, and well, he's a little older than me, not much though. One of my mentors. Okay, so Jung said that the dream is the small hidden door and the deep is the most intimate sanctum of the soul. So he's speaking about dreams that we have when we are sleeping, but it's also the dream that you have in your heart for your life, which opens to that primeval cosmic night that was soul long before there was conscious ego, and will be soul far beyond what a conscious ego could ever reach. So he's using the word soul to refer to the great all that is. Here's a model of the psyche. Self one is our egoic self, our little self, the little me. Self two is our higher self, right? And here it is, right? And here's the ego up here in the awareness, consciousness area. Actually, the line would go right across the middle here. And then he's got these dimensions. Jung called the shadow is the part of us that we disown. And we can recognize our shadow where our reactivity is, when we all have hot buttons, and that's the shadow, is when we're triggered. Those are shadow elements of ourselves that we can approach with the same process of Franklin's loving kindness meditation of embracing the painful things and allowing ourselves to feel them with porous openness. So the porousness sort of allows the feelings to flow like water flows and not damming them up. And the animus is the male female within. So the center of the circle, okay, this is an ancient drawing, but this isn't an ancient drawing, but it is ancient drawing, that the center of the circle is the deep self, right? That knows all of it, really. It's connected to you, and then it's connected to everything else too. So the deep self is our greatest advisor, because it has all the knowledge, right? And then we have conscious awareness up here at the top, and then the line, and then the unconscious. So your deep self is a genius, okay? And this is the last video we'll watch. You can see we're almost done. I know we're running a little over, but I want to show that your deep self is a genius. So we all want to tune in to the extraordinary, beautiful genius of our deep self, which again, direct clue is the things that we love. My partner loves to fly drones. They're everywhere in my house. He loves to fly them. He can't move around very much, but he can move around in the sky. And he always longed to be a pilot when he was young, and never was able to take that path. Wasn't encouraged enough. He gets so much joy from this, and that is the deep self expressing itself. And now he's thinking about teaching other people who can't move around very much the freedom that this gives. So what a beautiful gift that will be. People in wheelchairs, I mean, they can't move around. And he says, he realized that the expansiveness, so his delight is going to become others' freedom as well. And that's how the deep self works. All right, so your deep self is a genius. Michael Meade once again.
Genius is the thing that's quite misunderstood. People tend to think it means high IQ or profound talent, and those could be part of someone's genius, but that's not a definition of genius. It's a Latin word. It goes way back. And the oldest meaning I could find is the spirit that's already there. The genius is the spirit that's already there. So what does that mean? It means two things. It means the spirit that's already there when we come into the world, so that it's something that we are born with, that we are not aware of, just like the deep self. We're not aware of it, but it's there. But it also can be turned around to mean the spirit that brought us to life. So the genius is connected to the sense of having an genius. The spirit that's already there is what brought us to life. That is to say, we are aimed. We have genius qualities. I'll explain that in a minute. But we enter the world aimed. And part of the aim is to learn what the nature of the inner genius is and then learn how to express it. And I certainly would give Jung credit for making popular in the Western world, or somewhat popular, the idea that when a person expresses their deep self or soul, it is automatically beneficial to the world. That is to say, everyone enters this world gifted and aimed, and genius was a word that carried both of those notions. And so genius is trying to wake up inside each person. And you could say it in
genius is trying to wake up inside each person. So we want to fan the flames of that awakening. You know, when my partner was first learning to fly, he would bemoan, I don't have this problem, but this is his part of his shadow, right? He would bemoan that this is only for me. I'm not doing this for anybody else. Is this a stupid thing for me to doing since it's just my own pleasure? I'm like, no, it's that inner part of you because you get so much delight from it. And then lo and behold, a couple of years later, once he developed some mastery with it, he comes up with this awakening about how this can be liberating to others. See, that's how it works.
At least I would say, individuation involves an awakening to who we already are in the depth of our soul. What core imagination is there? What aim is there? What combination of gifts and talents are there? And if staying with the idea of becoming whole, what medicine is there? Because in the tribal traditions, you would have the notion, they have their own sense of what that deep self is. And the old idea is everyone comes into the world carrying medicine, and part of awakening is awakening to the genius, the spirit that's in the soul or in the self. And then what is the medicine? Because there are things, it could be medicine for others, but it's actually medicine that each person carries for themselves. And so you have the awakening to the genius, to the internal medicine. And then you have also the awakening to the aim and the purpose of life. So the old idea that each person is aimed at a destiny. Destiny is a star word. It comes from the Latin also, destinare. Each person is kind of aimed at a star. And the most important thing that's supposed to happen to a person, I think Jung might have said, the soul wants more than anything to transform. And that means to transform the kind of ego structure and the less awakened part of ourselves into an awake person who knows something about their gifts and has figured out some way to give them. And in the book, The Genius Myth, I try to suggest that the world is in so much trouble now, all of nature, all of culture, that everyone is being called to find their gifts and give them. That's the only way we get through these huge global crises. And the good news is everyone is gifted and aimed, and everyone is being called, even though many people don't hear the call. But as I try to remind everyone, no matter how old a person is, the calling keeps calling. And any moment in life could be the moment that we wake up to, in a greater way, to an inner understanding of who we are and why we're here.
Isn't that beautiful, y'all? Isn't that just beautiful? Your genius inside. The guest is inside you is another neat video that you can watch. We don't have time, but it's about that genius being inside you. Just click the link on the PowerPoint inside. And then I want to show you this little, I mentioned to you that the circle with the point in the middle is the symbol of the deep self, and the mandalas that you see everywhere, including things like labyrinths and stuff, are hold on a second. Our journeys to the deep self, right? So I'm just going to play or show you this PowerPoint about mandalas. I just wanted to put a little music on behind it. So that you can see them in the world. You can see that it's all woven in. This is a way of thinking about archetypes. So mandalas are all around us, everywhere. Whoops. And you'll start to see them everywhere after this. In the water crystal, circle in the middle, spiraling out. Source of life, mandala pattern. The mandala circle and the spiral that leads to its center are a favorite expression in nature. This is also one of the earliest drawings humans ever did. The growing spiral follows a precise mathematical pattern called the Fibonacci series, which follows a distinct sequence. Each number is the sum of the two preceding numbers. So 0 and 1 continue with 0, then 2 and 3 continue with 5, and that's how you create this symmetrical growing spiral, which is extraordinarily prevalent in nature. The dominant pattern of nature is the Fibonacci sequence. It's how nature grows things out. So we have that natural impulse in us, and it's also woven into our psyche, this spiral, this growing out. It's the creative pattern of galaxies, including the Milky Way. And it's also within us. It's the creative pattern of the DNA molecule. So our human ancestors drew these patterns. Those rocks are from about 40,000 BC. Journey to the center of the self. We can just feel our ancestors speaking to us through this, saying, I was here, I was here, I was here. You know, before language even, drawing this primal patterning that they sense. And so culture started to draw this. This is a medicine wheel, and you heard about Michael Meade talking about medicine that's healing abilities, healing powers, healing, giving of healing. This is Stonehenge. And this is what's called a labyrinth, where you walk it, and as you walk, you get closer and closer to the center of the self, is the idea. There's a labyrinth at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco that you can walk right there. I've walked it, it's beautiful. So we can see this patterning almost spontaneously emerging in things like the geometric patterns of stained glass at Chartres Cathedral and many, many other cathedrals. The Native American medicine wheel, which reflects the four directions, north, south, east, and west. This is a Sri Yantra, which is thought to bring enlightenment if you gaze at it and meditate. The expansive. This is the Tibetan sand mandala. Also north, south, east, and west, the four entry doors of the temple, and then filled with symbolism all the way around. And they make this painstakingly with sand, Tibetan monks do, while praying about specific things. And then when they've completed it, they dust it off. You can see the painstaking work. These little tiny things. And when it might take a week or a month to do a mandala, and then they dust it off and put it in a river with a releasing prayer as a tribute to the ebb and flow of life and releasing and letting go. It's a conscious and deliberate practice of letting go, and we can do our own releasing and letting go of mandalas when we let go of something gracefully. We can choose to gracefully let go of things. Letting go of a piece of rubbish can be a symbol of releasing and being willing to allow the letting go. I did this slideshow when Lobsang Semten came to Butte College and did a sand mandala. He was born in the foothills of Tibet. Just a small landmass in between India and China. And you don't need this part because you're not meeting Lobsang, but this is a neat quote from the Dalai Lama that we've all been born on this earth as part of one great human family, all connected by that web that we see on the World Wide Web. And that was a little ad for him. So that's it, you guys. Those drawings, those mandalic drawings that you do, coloring, are similar. I mean, we're tuning into our ancestors doing the same thing on the ground and on, like they would weave mandalas and tapestries and things. So we're doing a very ancient practice there when we draw mandalas or create them. That is that journey to the deep self. And I have very much appreciated you all on this great journey to the deep self we've had together. Yes.